Hey, Tada. Welcome, everybody, to the Municipal Bill podcast. As you know, guys, we are at that time of the year where municipalities are busy reviewing their IDPs. Some of them need to start working around their budgets that are going to be passed very soon. So we thought it would be very important for us to have guests, Municipal, who will talk to us about integrated development planning processes. I'm sure a lot of you know that municipalities have got this policy framework that they call the IDP. And obviously communities are being encouraged to participate in the IDP. You get all those invitations coming out from a municipality. Sometimes communities don't even get those invitations. They just hear through the grapevine that there is a community consultation meeting on an IDP. But what we would like to discuss today is to actually understand the importance of integrated development planning. I mean, there was another person who even commented the other day when I went to a Salga workshop. And then they said to me, well, an IDP is almost like a very integrated development plan.
Disintegrated at that.
So it says a lot. So our guests today who are going to take us through this conversation is Mpho. Mpho is a PhD candidate at Wits University. He is a practitioner. He's worked in one of the big metros in the municipality as a specialist in planning. And we also have Danga. Danga is with SS Cities Network, of course, but his main areas of focus and interest is local government development and governance. So, guys, welcome to our podcast.
Welcome. So as you were speaking, Tina, I noticed in the newspaper, there are already adverts calling people for public participation processes. So what would be interesting for me out of this conversation is to just, besides knowing what the IDP is the whole community participation process of the IDP and how, when people have commented on the IDP, how much does it shift or change what the people want? Because once it's written on a piece of paper and the municipality says this is what we want to do, how can I be assured that my comments in those meetings, that I'm able to see that they've changed something because they listen to me? That's my interest.
Exactly. Integrating developmental priorities that are of priority to you as a community member, but also as a household member who's paying the municipal bill. Yep. That's why we call our podcast Municipal Bill. Yeah. We pay for services. So, Mpho, let's just start from the foundations. What is an integrated development plan, and how does it actually contribute towards the planning processes leading up to the implementation of any programs and projects that a municipality needs to deliver in service delivery?
So thank you so much for having me, and hello to all the viewers and listeners. So I'll take it from parts where Sis Nosipho left off to say you really just want to get a sense of the community's involvement in an IDP. And I think conceptually that's what it aims to do, to say, let's start at the grassroots level. So that's where an IDP can apologies for that. Talk about Murphy's. So essentially there's two approaches to an IDP. There's the top-down approach as well as the bottom-up approach. I think conceptually they tried to really frame it as a bottom-up approach with the communities really get involved and drive the conversation. What priorities do we in terms of the services that we need from your community halls, from your road signals, potholes, anything that really people require when they interact with the municipality. Basically, that must be the first port of call to say, this is what we want our IDP to reflect. If I want to pay for water, I must make sure that I do pay for that water, but as the municipality, make sure that I do have access to that water. Water is a touchy subject. Not only the municipality I represent, or I come from, but municipalities, I think, across the country, water scarcity. So that's one of the issues. But in terms of the conversation being carried across to the politicians, and this is where a lot of, I think, municipalities have challenges with. I mean, for instance, when I was interviewed for this position, I had a question to say, how will you deal with when, on the one hand, you have the politicians having their priorities. On the other hand, you have the residents having their priorities. How do you deal with that?
Yeah.
And think simply it's just about the whole I in terms of the IDP, which is integration. And bringing the people and various stakeholders together.
Yeah.
If the residents can't have what they want, speak to civil society. Civil society can't get what they want, speak to business and various other stakeholders that are involved, and at some point just reach a common understanding, common place where you can both win.
But it sounds like it's such a huge task. I'm thinking, especially in the case of our metros, all the metropolitan municipalities, you're dealing with big departments, large populations. How do you manage to have that integration? Maybe what's the process of coming up with this integrated plan?
Well, a lot of sleepless nights. Because you're always in a state of flux. There's a lot of influence. And there's influence from those various stakeholders that I mentioned. And you also have politicians with their interests, whether political or otherwise. So it's a really fine and intricate balancing act that you always need to translate. Because when you write an IDP, essentially what you do is compile. And those views from those big departments need to find expression. Otherwise, you'll be on the chopping block. But we didn't say this on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's the residents who, in your first process of consultation, so you follow a process of consultation when it comes to an IDP. In your first round, you go to the communities, because that's that grassroots bottom-up approach. And then you come up and say, these are the projects that we want. Go to the departments then and entities then need to come back and say, this is what we can deliver. And oftentimes you find, for example, you mentioned about how the public consultation, second round of public consultation of the IEP draft is going to the communities. You'll find in certain instances, not all, where some projects are not reflected. Like I was saying about that, you're trying to really catch and streamline that conversation back to the communities. And oftentimes when you don't, that then becomes that issue about, well, this is not why we sent you there, because you're not really representing us. But it's also that really complicated, intricate split between politicians, administration, and your public.
Okay. So is there a law, like in terms of the law, is there a process, is there like a bare minimum that says if you're doing an IDP, these are the things that should be in the IDP, and this is how you should do it? I ask this because you're mentioning projects, and in my head I'm trying now to connect the dots between this big plan and it then ends up in projects. But if you can just help us out with legally, what's the minimum requirement for an IDP? And it could be either of you on this.
Maybe I'll start and then you can just chip in. Because IDP is highly, highly legislated. The bare minimum is in Chapter 4, 5, and 6 of the MSA Municipal Systems, which then ties you down in terms of accountability. Who you should be accountable to in the first instance. I think it's Chapter 4 that speaks to public engagements. So when it comes to community-based planning, that's essentially what an IDP should reflect, that you're planning based on the communities. You go out for your public consultation. And then you have your process where you have to factor in your budget. That then tells you how much is available in the kitty. So that I think is in Chapter 6 of the MSA. So if you factor in the budgets and you factor in the public, I think you've made at least 2 prescripts of what an IDP should be. But I think I'll let Danga go. Madam.
Well, I think what I would want to just point out is that perhaps, and maybe from the experience of having implemented the planning process, is there's almost a tension, two things, I think, is the expectation that was set at a particular place. So I think if we think of developmental local government, the times of transition, and then developing the local government system, I think it'd be fair to say, and once again, that for many reasons, at least those who are politically active, there's a sense that they would have much more. Going to your point is, but I said I wanted this in my neighborhood, and I don't see it. So it's not just a matter of, if didn't on a technical basis, you can say, okay, it costs so much, we had to do something else that costs so much, therefore you completely do yours. But then there's a sense of, but if I've been spoken to, like you'd expect that you've been heard. And so there's that tension, inherent tension. I would think, from the outside at least, I've always been very interested in that tension. So you have your legislation, as you say, very clear, very and very purposeful in what it's supposed to achieve. But then it's trying to, in a sense, writing out what perfection would look like, and the reality is more messy. So I think that's what I find really interesting, is the IDP process.
Absolutely. And actually, talking about reality, coming back to the reality of South African citizens and communities and the way in which they are connected or disconnected with municipalities, it also stems from the place where there are certain expectations that communities have when it comes to the delivery of services and having their priorities being expressed in an IDP. But with time, communities find that some of these expectations are not met. And that's where you start seeing this disconnection. And it actually, erodes the participatory governance aspect to it. But tell me, Danga, but what does that do to the sustainability of our participatory governance systems, where you are seeing less and less communities participating because of their aggrieved, notions that their voices are not being heard, they're not being integrated into planning?
I think it probably, stemming on and building on from that expectations issue, I think then, because we as citizens, we look to our politicians, I think it mostly affects the politicians in terms of the relationship, at least, that the citizens have with the politician. And they say that, if you are my representative, you heard me, and then I would expect you to be doing the things that I would want.
Of course.
Yeah, so I think, and what we're seeing over time perhaps is some of that maybe trust, some of that belief that this person is really there for me.
Yes.
It's slightly eroded over time, and you'll see it maybe with the election results, particularly in local government, I think, where there's a sense that there's a sort of a withdrawal from the political process, where people feel that, well, I spoke 10 years ago, I spoke again 5 years ago, I feel like you didn't really listen to me both times, so maybe I don't feel as confident in your ability to deliver what I would like. And so I think it's more a withdrawal, and worst case scenario, actually it becomes anger, where you see at a very basic level, because I think the IDP covers, of course, all developmental projects within a municipality. But if you ask someone, basic services be something, and many of those basic services protests would be to say that this isn't just about not meeting perhaps the vision for our community that we had, which is a long-term vision, and oftentimes those visions are quite a beautiful vision, but this is just nuts and bolts things which I'm not getting. So don't come and talk to me about a vision, So I think that is the political implications sometimes of this tension, which you can't really blame either party, but it seems to be an unintended consequence.
Interesting that you should mention the vision, because you said this plan is for how many years?
So IDP is usually medium to short.
Medium to term. What is medium?
So medium is 5 years.
5 years.
Term is a year.
It's a year.
Yes.
So how does it work? Because every year I see these adverts. So...
Correct. So legislation says you need to have 5-year IDP, right? Where that's the medium term. And in between, you then do your review. So your annual reviews are then trying to gauge whether or not we're keeping up with that medium-term vision that we have. That's legislated. What's not legislated, the long-term plan, which in some instances is called a growth and development strategy. So some cities have subscribed to it, some municipalities have, some haven't. That is more long-term, where you're trying to measure impact instead of outcomes or outputs. So your short-term, then your outputs and your outcomes, which is then what the IDPs are trying to do. But in that, you should have a vision, and which is linked up closely to your long-term vision for whatever city.
So this vision, how long is it for? I'm trying to understand, because visions, they take time to be realized. So how long is this vision meant to be held for?
Yeah, look.
Or does it depend on the political office bearer, who might be the mayor of a city, to set the vision and the goals that the administration will follow, and he or she and his executive would be able to implement? Because it's very important that you ask that, especially under the changes, the political changes and the instabilities that we have in our cities. I remember the city of Joburg used to be called, there was this word that was used, the modern African city.
And then Cape Town is a city
Can you see that I've even forgotten what it should be called? Because that was sort of like a vision that the former mayor of city of Joburg, who used to be Puff Star, would make sure that it is imbibed within our memories as citizens. But now we don't even know what is the motto or vision or goal of city of Joburg. It's sort of like has fizzled away.
I have seen some, and I will give you a chance maybe to respond, because I've seen visions change. And what I also want to know is it a legal requirement that municipalities should have a vision?
Yeah, as a bare minimum, absolutely. And once again, it's the MSA legislates that. And I'll take from Danga's point about the rigidity of municipal legislation. But kudos to South Africa for trying to ignite this conversation about changing legislation. I mean, there's a review, local white paper on local government. I think there's a review that's happening there. There's a review on the broad spectrum of municipal systems or act in general happening currently. And that's to accommodate this constant state of flux that we find ourselves in. Tying down a vision to the more practical, I think that's the conversation that some municipalities are currently having.
Okay.
Joburg in particular is now talking about resilience, livability, as well as sustainability. But we've reintroduced that whole concept of the world-class African city. Remember, the vision is tied to the politicians and the term of office, which is reflective of what people want on the ground.
Okay.
So the people will then elect certain individuals into office. And when those individuals come to office, they either do one of two things. They either overhaul or have continuity. So what you're finding lately with coalitions, that there's an overhaul process. So now we're just trying to backtrack and just say, let's perhaps recover from the overhaul.
So now I'm concerned, and I'll tell you, I'm worried, not even concerned. Let me use a stronger word. I'm worried because if your vision changes ever so often, there's a very strong chance that you will not realize it. And Danga, I'd love to hear your views on this. Because all along, Mpho, you've said to us, this IDP process is very participatory.
Yep.
And we will talk, maybe we should talk later on around when we say it's a participatory process, which elements of this IDP are we participatory on? Maybe it's just on the projects, I do not know. But if us as the municipal residents have said, no, we buy into this vision, and now you want to change it, come back to me and say, I'm changing it. And maybe let me hear from you, Danga. I'll come back to the long-term thing that you spoke about, but I'd like to hear your views around this 5-year term, 5-year thing, and the changing of the vision.
Yes. I mean, I think it's a tension that's very real. And one that I think has become more apparent. So we talked about the changes in people's feelings about various politicians and how they've been manifested in the politicians they elected. I think they said, okay, so-and-so didn't achieve this for us, so then we elect someone else.
And by the way, that's also contested, Danga, because when you look at the composition of a mayoral committee and a mayor, citizens would actually say, but that we didn't elect that mayor.
Not that one.
Not that one.
Not that one.
Not that one.
Exactly.
You guys went and, we bartered behind the scenes, and then you brought this mayor to us. Yeah. And we don't even know what vision he has for the city anyway.
I mean, but also I think when the vision, I think, would be so, and we can say that, but the vision, whether for the country or for municipalities, was so clear, because I think that the past was so stark and so obviously wrong that I think, as opposed to other places where you're sort of hair splitting about visions, but I think the general vision, a better life for all, let's say, really, is something that everyone can in many ways can sign up to. But as you say, some of those things, particularly where we're talking about the kinds of things that cities spend money on, which is a lot of this big projects. As you say, what happens when a big project that is a manifestation of a particular vision, then someone else comes along and says, but I'm not so into this project anymore, and I want to change it. And we saw it specifically in our city here in Joburg, with, say, the Corridors of Freedom, which is a big project around transit-oriented development, so wanting to have, I suppose, altering transport patterns in such a way that they spur development and make it easy for people to get to work and so on. And that requires, investment and activity over a long period of time for it to manifest. And yet we suddenly saw, literally there were places where one day there was construction work going on a rear via stop, and then the next 2 weeks later it stopped, and it stops for 5 years. And now I see, it's picking up again, So that, to go to your question, I don't really have an answer, but it is a bit worrying when something that so clearly, I think objectively you'd say would do something good for people, changes because of vision, a political leadership changes.
But so maybe the change is a symptom of a bigger problem. What could be the bigger problem? Because, if people have bought into this thing, because you write it, I do not remember a time in my municipality where we were asked to submit in boxes our Mpho's vision. Somebody wrote a vision, sold it to us, we bought into it. And now when they change it without, that must signify something bigger than you just changing a vision. What is that?
That's a good question. Or maybe we ourselves have ourselves to blame as citizens. Were we actually putting in those suggestions to that?
Were we asked to put those?
Or were we asked to?
Or did we take an initiative?
Take an initiative.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I actually want to bring you in, Mpho, because you've worked in the space of local government in one of the metros, and you've observed changes from a perspective of being a practitioner. But at the same time, you are intellectually, immersed in understanding some of the political changes and how they contribute towards a sustained developmental trajectory in a municipality. And an IDP obviously lays that, policy groundwork. So with the changes that do happen, today you've got one member of a mayoral committee. They are in that position for a year. Things don't work out. And then there are shifts in the system. And then there's another member of the mayoral committee that is elected because they want to form an executive, committee that is going to work within a coalition, let's say, for instance. So when it comes to the reviewing process of the IDP, have you noticed through the world of practice any changes through reviews where an MMC will say, but this is not my priority right now? Because at the end of the day, politicians also want to be seen to be doing work in the municipalities. And let's say that MMC comes from a constituency in Region G, and that MMC will want to prioritize Region G in resource allocations through the IDP. What are your observations? Have you seen any of these practices?
Yeah, and I like that the fact that you're talking now about priorities. I'd rather have the conversation be at a level of priority. Whether it's around health issues or human settlements issues, whether it's around smart city issues or youth issues. You have a lot of MNCs having conversations around priorities, reflecting what they want for their particular constituency. And that then ties the conversation back down to public participation.
Yeah.
But in terms of from an administration point of view, I think what protects and what insulates a lot of officials is the Structures Act. So the Structures Act already outlines what officials and MMCs, members of mayoral committees, are supposed to do. And it really outlines to say, this is your role, this is where you play, and this is your role, this is where you play. And of course, the lines do tend to be blurred, especially now with the coalitions. But legislation, once again, is trying to be flexible, respond to that. So you have an accounting officer, which is a city manager or municipal managers in other instances. They essentially protect the administration. They're the face of the administration. And then you have the mayor, who's the face of the executive. So these interfaces are quite important when it comes to ensuring that the vision of the city or the vision of the municipality continues. And just apart from whatever changes there might be politically. So it's embedded within legislation. And the translation of it is where I think Danga's point about the tension arises. To say, well, because of this political change, how do we then continue? So the grey area is now starting to surface with the politics of politicization of local government is a real thing.
Yes.
And I think our legislation has become reactionary. And you get a lot of administrators not being mature enough to read the room. So administrators will tend to play in the grey areas. And that's where a lot of things are lost, because you can't be a politician as well as an administrator. And that's what we're finding is this happening. And a lot of people like to blame the politicians, but in certain instances, it's no longer becoming their fault. We see more and more that there's influence that's being crept into in terms of administrators trying to play both sides.
Oh, yes. What's the cost of that for the ordinary citizen?
Well, the issue around priorities, right? So now it's no longer the resident's priority or the citizen's priority that's being reflected, but somebody's own person. They were appointed
And
by certain.
And obviously the politics of self-preservation, it starts to creep in. I think we touched on it when we were having discussions at our launch at the beginning of the year, when we said there is an element of self-preservation amongst senior officials who are supposed to be serving as administrators and bureaucrats who are not supposed to immerse themselves into any politics, but because obviously there's a lot of pressure, they've got political heads, relationships might go sour, and then they find themselves having to now respond to these political agendas. Yeah, so I think it does, in a way, sort of like correlate with some of the developments that we see changing, and the dynamics and the concentration of resource allocations to certain spaces and places that might not necessarily be aligned with the overall IDP.
All of a sudden, I'm thinking that maybe I shouldn't be, I don't know how I survived being a municipal official. I'm listening to what you're saying, because on one hand, you've got these developmental objectives that you need to uphold. And you also need to be agile enough whenever there's a change, there are changes in the politics, and that tension that you're talking about. Surely sometimes it raises ethical issues for officials, but maybe it's a discussion for another day. I have my own views about municipal officials, and if one day I have enough money, I will do a study that looks at the mental health of municipal officials, and I think it would just be shocking, because the amount of tension that these guys have to go through, not even just at a senior level, of middle management, and even a level lower than that. But I digress. I have a specific question to ask, and I'm going back now to the long-term vision. Sorry, Mpho, I love these visions. So earlier on, we were talking about the growth and development strategy. And I suspect that that's a longer one. IDP is 5 years, get reviewed every year. And then you've got a longer term vision of a municipality. That you said it's also required by law. How's that working out, Danga?
I think, unfortunately, not quite as we would have wanted. I think, I'd love to hear from Mpho, based on the actual experience. My reading from the outside is that in many ways, it's become, or rather, and I suppose being in many ways a technical document, that the focus then on particular outputs and outcomes means that you sort of get stuck in kind of this detail here, but then a vision, requires you to lift your head and see really further down. And so I think at times, I feel like sometimes this long-term vision, so the world-class African city, for example, if people are not constantly being reminded, through by leadership or so on, that you can sometimes lose that long-term vision. And so even as you say, going from, let's say, well, there's a SD BIP would say the year
What is an SDP?
And service delivery.
Yeah.
Budget recommendation to plan.
Okay, so what is it? Sorry, Danga.
See, think that.
Oh, I think it would almost be like the annual performance plan for the municipal manager, right?
Yes. Oh, okay.
Yes, but which is informed by the IDP.
IDP.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
IDP, but for that particular.
So it's more granular than the IDP. Okay.
You know,
All right.
and so if you go to that, then you go to the IDP. Then let's say you go to the city development strategy. Sometimes, even if that strategy exists, I think you need a constant reminder of those links between that broader strategy and this IDP that you have, in order to keep it alive. Because I think in some ways, that vision can fall away if we're not constantly reminded of it.
And then, Danga, I have a question which comes back to the integratedness of a development plan and the consultative participatory process. Now, from a city's perspective, because I know you work for SS Cities Network, we've got a city such as Johannesburg. It's a very diverse and dynamic city. It's changing. It's now reflective, of what global cities are having to deal with, whether it's global south or the global north. And there are communities that are migrating to the cities, not just only domestically, but internationally. South Africa is positioned as one of the countries where we are having other African sisters and brothers who are coming into the country because obviously peace and insecurity and economic instability in the region. Now the city is becoming more diverse. It's becoming more diverse. In fact, that's why I interchangeably use the word citizens and communities. Citizens, because we need to be careful. If you're going to only use citizens, are you excluding those who don't have South African IDs and passports, etc.? And they are living in these communities. They are part of our communities. Some of their children are born in this country, So when we talk about now the consultation process of communities and citizens in a city, is a city like Johannesburg ready to understand that they've got diversity and they need to be inclusive, even though they've got communities who are not necessarily with what you call this ID holders of being a South African citizen, because they live in the city. They do, particularly in the inner part of the city.
So whose voices is included in the integration?
In that consultation process of the IDP, or are we being exclusionary? I don't know. I would like to get your perspective on it.
Well, I mean, I think you would want to include everyone. I mean, I suppose everyone who's in the city lives in the city and is as I say, keep lasting citizen. But then there's obviously the actual tensions that tend to happen when you have influxes of people who are coming looking for work. So there's and people feel that they're competing for resources. So it's difficult because you can't. I think the danger is to take the high road, which is our constitution has, and I think you've seen that in the discourse, which is that yes, it's not to say that people who are complaining about the challenges are not being loyal to the constitution. I suppose it's an honest human feeling that maybe this person is taking away some resources from me or not, or maybe they shouldn't have the same say about this vision that I have for the place that I live in. So that's, I think, a natural human thing. But the question is, how do we delicately sort of negotiate those tensions? And I think one of the ways that it best done is, I think, having the city operate efficiently. Because when people feel that things aren't necessarily going as they had hoped, then you start looking around and saying, well, what's the reason for this? And I think in the worst case scenario, and often leads to the rise of populists, is people then blame others. Doesn't exist. So I think, it'd be interesting to see if you did a correlation between the rise in the sentiments of, are people really a part of our community or not? And the perception of how their services are being delivered, or whether they feel they're getting what they expected from the city. You'd find they probably correlate. So as people become more dissatisfied with their living conditions and are looking for explanations for it, I think you may find that then that singling out of perhaps other people who may not, or they feel may not have the same claim to be, a resident, starts in place. But it's difficult, I think, and so many places struggle with this, and particularly when you have a country that is successful, at least relative to its neighbours, they really face that challenge. I mean, we're seeing it now in the US.
Absolutely.
It's sort of uniquely.
Yeah.
Can probably.
Yeah. Talking about participation, so I told you that I saw the advert, and I want to understand, because how you choose to engage people can also deter. It can either deter or encourage people to participate. So the 3 adverts that I've seen from municipalities, small municipalities, category B municipalities, and metros are calling people into a town hall. And here I am sitting and thinking, one, you want a meeting on a Saturday after it's month end. Got my paddy booked in my hair. 2, you're calling me to a town hall. How much engagement, meaningful engagement is going to take place through that? But 3, you've given me a website link to where I'm going to access this document that's going to be discussed. It's sitting on average 300 pages. I mean, the advert went out yesterday. The meetings are starting tomorrow. And I'm not saying one municipality. I'm saying in these municipalities, different categories. I'm like thinking, these people are deliberate. They've got their target market, and clearly I am not the target market. Clearly I'm not.
Yeah, I don't want to be drawn into the conversation, whether it's deliberate or not. But I'll certainly say that, and this is where legislation sometimes gets things right. So you have to have a process plan to develop an IDP at least 10 months before the next financial year.
Yeah.
And that allows you to then set your timelines, quarterly, monthly, even annually, to say by this time, you want to be sure that you're taking the IDP for public consultation, whether it's your second round or whether it's your first round. So it's not really about whether or not people are going to be doing their hair on the following day. The process has long been thought of. There's a calendar that says by this period, you need to have had your public consultations.
I don't disagree with your process. If the law says engage with people and you say our resources allow us to engage with people at this time frame, monthly, this is what we'll do. Process is fine. It's now how you then do it. I just find it absurd that you would want to engage with people who, different people in each municipality who we know that our demographics, you do have your town hall people, and I don't want to box people, but you also have people that you know are not going to come to a town hall. If you take, for an example, and I'm going to take and use, some municipalities call them regions, others call them zones. It's a combination of wards. Sometimes it's more than 50 wards. Well, no, not 50, maybe 25 wards. And then you say these people must come to a community hall. Already, that community hall can take up to 300 people. You've already said in 25 wards that probably have, I don't know how many people, when you are accommodating 300 people to be part of this process, everybody else, go read this document, figure it out yourself, and then email us the comments.
It's a tough one. It's tough because I know I'm fully agree with you, but how else could you do it? I mean, I know technology has changed things and so on, but as you say, you're trying to get the views of many people, into and then to give them as many opportunities to have that, to have their say. But would you really do it?
But maybe Danga, I'm asking us to think and look at, because our legislation, South African legislation, there's an opportunity to change it.
Yeah.
So if there is a better way of doing it, then I'm merely presenting a problem.
Yeah.
That we need to think about.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then it also pushes us to think about ways in which community organizing used to be done back in the days. of course, we've got our ward committee systems. People are elected to sit in that ward committee, look at the various, angles of development, et cetera, in consultation, of course, with their chairperson, who's the councillor. But then remember, we are densely populated communities. Mm-hmm. What happened to the notion of having street committees that could form what we call neighborhood governance, where this community organizing can actually facilitate, a discussion on an IDP before the IDP is actually provided by the municipality, but just to have that engagement to say that as this neighborhood or this small little community, we think that as the IDP process is about to unfold, our priorities in this neighborhood are A, B, C, and D, which interlink with the rest of the ward. And they take it up to a ward committee and representative. I don't know, but I think we have lost touch with this whole concept of community organizing, street level community organizing.
Or maybe it's because, it could also be because these processes are facilitated from a government perspective, and us as the citizenry have not thought about ways in which we can supplement or enhance what government does. It bothers us, but it doesn't bother us enough to act. And I'll even make another example. You're talking at a street level, the street level kind of engagement. Here I am sitting and saying, so if I am a business that is located in Umhlanga, that's where our headquarters are. We are a client of the municipality, so therefore we should be interested in the IDP. And if the IDP meetings are taking place in that area, are you expecting me to go to the town hall? Or do we then create other platforms to engage with business on the IDP? It would be nice to hear some practice on that.
Yeah, no. Well, business is one of our stakeholders as municipalities. And then you also have people living with disabilities. Mm-hmm. You also have the youth and other vulnerable groups. Mm-hmm. And then you have what you can classify as society, and all of them that fall under that category. Mm-hmm. And then you obviously have your residents. So going back to, I think, the point about communities, I think Johannesburg is one metro that I think does this quite well, because you have a department that's called Citizen Relationship and Urban Management, which is actually based within the communities. On the one hand, they might be headquartered in the actual office of the city. Then you have your regional directors, which are also located within municipal offices that are satellite stations within the various wards that you were talking about, or regions that you were talking about. So if there's about 7 regions in the city of Johannesburg, you have about 7 satellites, so to speak. And then you also have your speaker's office or legislature, which sort of drives the conversation around public participation. They're legislated to keep the neutrality, in terms of the separation of powers when it comes to your executive and your council and your administration. That's where legislation comes in. They're the core face of the residents, and they keep the councillors, ward councillors and PR councillors accountable to actually what happens in terms of translating what the city does to the resident, vice versa, what the resident wants to the actual city. And then you have in the department called Group Strategy, Policy Coordination and Relations, you have the people who actually steer the community-based planning sessions. So that entire process is really trying to speak to gathering and drawing meaningful public participation from the people, the grassroots. I think the issue might be underfunding of communication.
Okay.
The information gets lost through a broken telephone in some instances, or you just don't put enough capacity in your communications department. And we're now in the era of digitization, and which is actually interestingly one of the priorities that the city of Johannesburg is trying to bring into the next IDP about the digital economy. So how are we then going to use this AI space and this technology and these podcasts to actually drive our messages across beyond the public, beyond the meetings, council meeting, beyond an email? You're interacting with a document of about 400 pages. not going to read the entire thing. I don't have time. How else can I engage with it? Are you translating your IDP to make it more accessible? Are you writing it down? Are you making it like a easily digestible document for you to engage it? A 6-page IDP, when are we going to get to that space?
And maybe Mpho, the 6-page IDP also, because I need to caution, a 6-page IDP is not the list of projects. Because from what you've explained to me, IDP is bigger than the list of projects, but it's about me understanding why those projects, what's the vision behind them.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was Danga who spoke about the SD, which is then the translation of that long-term vision that your city has to your actual operationalization of how you're going to get there in the day-to-day. So your SD BIP, then over and above your 6-page IDP, is another document that residents can engage with over and above that 6-page to say, these are the projects and these are the performance indicators for me as a resident to hold the city accountable, to say, in this 3 months, you guys said you're going to do this. So why isn't this happening? Over and above all the other Chapter 9 institutions, you can call them, that are trying to keep the city accountable. Because I want to go back to your point about why certain municipalities don't deliver or why they're sort of reactive. And there's a lot of pressures that I think politicians and administrators deal with. And among those, in this highly legislated environment, is the avoidance of important time. We really don't want that. It makes your administration look bad, whether you're a politician or a municipal manager.
I actually like the point that you did raise about a 6-page IDP. In fact, it would make life so easy if an IDP was just even 2 pages. And I'm going to come back to the point of digital technology. We are not really tapping into digital technology because most of us are on our smartphones. We love those apps. We love short surveys. When you get a very short surveys, you quickly answer the questions. So if, let's say, I'm looking at this, let's say the IDP encompasses basic infrastructure provision, infrastructural development and housing, economic growth and employment opportunities, public transport or disaster management. If, let's say, a city had organized an app where when it's time for IDP consultations, you can click on a link and it gives you these 5 options to...
Says not even an app, a WhatsApp call.
Absolutely. Data, by the way, because it will pick up my geographical location and my ward. And then because we've got water leakages, serious, it's a very old neighborhood. So we've got water leakages. For me, when it comes to infrastructure development, I would click on water. Can we please prioritize water in my neighborhood? Economic opportunities, fine. Maybe my ward or my neighborhood doesn't have a lot of unemployment, but we need a shopping center or we need a space to have a market, open market. I can click there. We would like to have the city allocate some space for us to have an open market day. You see, it makes things easy. Then you start using that data to analyze the inputs that are being made by our communities according to the different areas that they are living in. I'm saying this because I come from an M&E background. Now we're talking about digitization of M&E data.
I actually 100% agree with you, Tina. I do think that this discussion is not... It seems like we've had an interesting discussion understanding what the IDP is, public participation. We started coming up with ideas of how it can be enhanced. Now I understand that the IDP is not just about a list of projects, but I'm still interested in knowing about, okay, then you have this plan, which is meant to be integrated. How do I hold the city to account on this plan? And maybe in the future episodes, we'll need to bring in the Auditor General as well, because they also now play a part, not just on the finances, but also they audit things that we committed in the IDP. So it's a good a base discussion for me to know how I need to engage with the IDP. I recognize, though, that there are practice gaps that need to be filled in the process that do not mean that I don't need to engage in the IDP because I pay the municipality for services, and therefore I should be interested in knowing what are they prioritizing. Okay,
I'm built connects me with my municipality. Danga, any parting shots? Because I mean, we spoke about this community of practice, the tensions that there are in the system of local government. So, I mean, how do we really improve the practice and the everyday realities in conjunction to what a document says? Just feel parting shots on that.
Well, I think the one thing is, I think, is a humbling. So hearing from Mpho about what actually happens and is different from the view that you get from the outside. So there actually is, there's a sense perhaps sometimes that, oh, the city just does their thing, they say they're doing this, but there actually are efforts. So hugely encouraged by the discussion around, say, digitization and bringing that to the people and making it work for us. I think that at this present time, that would be a really big innovation, I think, to introduce. I think there'll always be this sense, perhaps, among some people that they've either been asked and not asked, or other people say that I spoke and I wasn't listened to. Other people just say, I don't care. And I suppose that's one other thing. Maybe we should also, I think, be kind to ourselves and say that's kind of just the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think we can be a bit, harsh and say, maybe if we looked a bit further forward and said, there's actually just kind of human nature, the way things work. But I think, definitely digitization and finding ways that we can make this digital innovations work in terms of getting input, as I say, monitoring the interaction between citizens and residents, rather, and their city would be a good way forward.
Audience, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to our guests, our very knowledgeable people who have joined us today, which is Danga and Mpho. They've given us some knowledge and shed some light into IDP processes. So what we'd like to say to you is that please try to participate. I know we are very lethargic these days because we've lost confidence in our municipalities, but it's important. If we are paying our bills, we've got to understand that we've got to find ways in which we influence the direction that a city is taking when it comes to planning for our infrastructure, service delivery, our economy, etc. So thank you for joining us. Do join us next time. And I would like to thank our main sponsor, which is Empire Partner Foundation. Please subscribe so that you will get notifications for our next episode. From me and Nosipho, take care. Bye.